They arrived in the summer of 1720. 9,000 German-speaking settlers recruited from the Rhineland and the Palatinate with promises that would make a prophet blush. Free land along the Mississippi River, soil so rich it birthed gold. A new world Eden, where any man could become a lord. What they found was a swamp, knee-deep mud, air thick enough to chew, mosquitoes that carried fevers with no name, no roads, no houses, no gold, nothing but the slow brown current of the Mississippi and the sound of people beginning to die. Within months, 80% of them were dead. Dysentery, starvation, yellow fever. The corpses piled so quickly that the survivors stopped digging graves and simply rolled the bodies into the river. And every single one of those 9,000 people had been lured to their death by a piece of paper, a banknote, issued by a convicted murderer who had somehow become the most powerful financial mind in France. His name was John Law, and the instrument he invented to kill them is in your wallet right now. This is the story of the Mississippi Bubble. It is not a story about markets. It is a story about what happens when a brilliant man discovers that money is a fiction and decides to write a better one. To understand what happened on that riverbank, you have to start 24 years earlier, in a very different kind of ruin. London, April 1694, a narrow street near Bloomsbury Square. Two men face each other with drawn swords. One of them is Edward Wilson, a well-connected gentleman with a modest fortune and a jealous temperament. The other is a 23-year-old Scotsman named John Law, tall, strikingly handsome, and possessed of the kind of mathematical mind that makes other men uncomfortable at the card table. The duel is over a woman. It lasts less than a minute. Wilson falls. He does not get up. John Law is arrested, tried for murder, and sentenced to death. And this is where the story should end. A young man's temper, a sword, a gallows. But John Law escapes from prison. The details are murky, possibly a bribed guard, possibly a window, and flees to the continent. He will never return to England. Instead, for the next 20 years, he wanders Europe as a fugitive, a gambler, and increasingly as something far more dangerous. A man with a theory. You see, John Law was not merely a gambler. He was a mathematician who gambled. He understood probability before most people understood arithmetic. In Venice, they called him Beau Law, a dandy with a sharp jaw and sharper odds. He drifted through the gambling salons of Amsterdam, Genoa, Turin, calculating while others prayed. He didn't play games of chance. He played games of information, watching the table, reading the pattern, understanding that the cards themselves mattered less than the behavior of the men holding them. At a faro table in Venice, Law could tell you the precise probability of any draw. At a baccarat table in Paris, he could calculate the expected return of every wager before the shoe was dealt. He won consistently, not because he was lucky, but because he treated gambling the way Newton treated gravity, as a system of hidden laws waiting to be decoded. But it was not the cards that fascinated him. It was the money on the table. He watched how it moved, how confidence created value, how a whispered rumour at one end of a coffee house could double a man's fortune at the other end before anyone verified whether the rumour was true. He watched men bet their estates on nothing more than the mood in a room. And from those tables, Law derived an insight that was 2 centuries ahead of its time. Money is not gold. Money is not silver. Money is belief. A coin has value because a crowd agrees it has value. Remove the crowd's agreement and the coin is just a disc of metal, which means, and here is the thought that would eventually kill 9,000 settlers, if belief is the true currency, then a sufficiently persuasive man can manufacture money from nothing but confidence. He wrote it all down. A treatise called Money and Trade Considered, published in 1705. The central argument was radical. A nation strangled by a shortage of gold and silver coins could simply print paper money, backed not by metal, but by the productive capacity of the land itself. More money in circulation would stimulate trade. Stimulated trade would increase wealth. Increased wealth would justify the paper that created it. A perfect circle. Self-fulfilling prophecy dressed in the language of economics. Scotland rejected the idea. England, where he was still a wanted murderer, was not an option. But France was desperate. By 1715, France was a financial corpse. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had spent 60 years waging wars and building palaces, and when he finally died in September of that year, he left behind a debt so vast it exceeded the entire annual revenue of the kingdom by a factor of 20. 3 billion livres owed, 150 million in annual revenue. The math was not complicated, it was simply fatal. The treasury was empty. Tax collectors were murdered in the streets because the people had nothing left to give and the collectors kept coming anyway. Soldiers went unpaid. Creditors gathered outside the Palais Royal like vultures on a fence. The government could not service its debt, could not pay its servants, could not fund its wars. France was, by any rational measure, bankrupt. And bankruptcy, for a monarchy, is not an accounting problem. It is an existential one. The new regent, Philippe d'Orléans, was a pragmatist with a drinking problem and no ideas. He had tried the obvious solutions, debasing the coinage, defaulting on selective debts, squeezing the tax farmers harder, and each one had made things worse. When John Law arrived in Paris with his treatise and his charm and his absolute conviction that he could save France with paper, Philippe listened, not because he believed Law, because he had no one else to believe. In 1716, Law was granted permission to open the Banque Générale, a private bank authorized to issue paper banknotes. The notes could be used to pay taxes, which gave them instant credibility. Within a year, the bank was a success. Commerce accelerated, credit flowed, the economy stirred. John Law, the fugitive, the murderer, the gambler, was hailed as a genius. And then he did what every genius eventually does. He decided the small miracle wasn't enough. He wanted the large one. In 1717, Law acquired control of the Company of the West, a French colonial venture holding a monopoly over the vast, unmapped territory of Louisiana. The territory stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. On a map, it looked like an empire. In reality, it was mosquitoes and mud. But John Law did not sell reality. He sold a dream. He merged the Company of the West with France's other colonial trading companies, the East India Company, the China Company, the Africa Company, creating a single gargantuan entity, the Compagnie Perpétuelle des Indes, the Mississippi Company. On paper, it now controlled all of France's foreign trade. Then he merged it with the Royal Mint, then with the National Tax Collection System. Then, in a move that still astonishes historians, he effectively merged it with the French national debt itself, allowing holders of government bonds to convert their claims into shares of his company. The government's crushing debt simply vanished, absorbed into the stock of a company whose primary asset was a swamp. The stock price began to climb and climb and climb. Here is where you need to understand what happened on the Rue Quincampoix. The Rue Quincampoix was a narrow medieval street in Paris, perhaps 12 feet wide. In 1719, it became the unofficial stock exchange for Mississippi Company shares, and it became, for several months, the most frenzied place on earth. Aristocrats and servants pressed together in the same crowd. Dukes stepped over beggars to reach the brokers. A hunchbacked man rented out his back as a writing desk and made a fortune. A cobbler on the street sold his shop, bought shares, and became richer than the nobleman who'd been his landlord. A servant woman reportedly turned a small investment into enough money to buy a carriage and 4 horses, then rode through the streets laughing at the countesses who used to give her orders. The street itself became almost impassable. Makeshift offices appeared in doorways. Noise filled the air from dawn until well past midnight. Residents on the Rue Quincampoix rented out their rooms at obscene prices, not for sleeping, but simply for access to a window where a man could shout his buy orders into the crowd below. The shares that Law had initially offered at 500 livres climbed past 2,000, then 5,000, then 10,000, then, at the peak of the mania, over 18,000 livres, a gain of 3,600% in a matter of months. France lost its mind, and the word they used for it was millionaire. They had to invent the word, because the concept had never existed before. John Law didn't just create paper money, he created the idea of overnight, limitless wealth, the millionaire. It is his invention, his gift to the language and to the imagination of every speculator who came after. But the Mississippi Company had a problem that no amount of belief could solve. It needed Louisiana to actually produce something. And Louisiana produced nothing. Law sent thousands of settlers, the German Rhinelanders, convicts emptied from French prisons, women snatched from the streets of Paris and forced onto ships. They were told they were sailing to paradise. The propaganda engravings showed natives offering baskets of gold to smiling colonists beneath fruit trees. What waited for them was the lower Mississippi Delta, a floodplain of swamp cypress and stagnant water, temperatures that broke European bodies, diseases for which no European immune system was prepared. The settlements along what is now the German coast of Louisiana were death camps without fences. No one was imprisoned. There was simply nowhere to go. They built crude shelters from cypress bark and river mud. They ate whatever they could find: roots, crawfish, occasionally an alligator killed with a hand-forged spear. The children died first, then the elderly, then the women weakened by the crossing. The men buried their families in the silt and kept working because the alternative was to lie down and join them. A French officer stationed in the region wrote that the German settlers died with a kind of quiet bewilderment, as if they could not quite believe that the same civilization that had issued them beautiful printed documents promising paradise had sent them here to rot. They kept the documents. Some were found clutched in the hands of the dead, as if the paper itself might yet redeem the promise. The letters that trickled back to France told a story so different from the propaganda that the government tried to intercept them. But rumours cannot be intercepted, and by late 1719, the first cracks were showing. The unravelling began not with the poor, but with the clever. Prince de Conti, one of the wealthiest men in France, arrived at Law's bank with 3 wagons and demanded to convert his Mississippi shares into gold coin. Law was horrified. If the prince could do it, everyone would try. He persuaded the regent to pass a decree. No individual could hold more than 500 livres in gold or silver. The state would confiscate the rest. Read that again. In order to protect his paper money system, John Law had to make it illegal to own real money. This was the moment the spell broke. Not all at once. Spells never break all at once, but in a slow, sickening cascade. If the paper was truly as good as gold, why did the government need to ban gold to protect it? The question spread through Paris, like the fever spreading through Louisiana. The share price began to fall. Law tried everything. He merged his bank with the Mississippi Company, making them a single entity, which meant the institution that printed money and the institution whose stock was collapsing were now the same thing. He printed more banknotes to buy shares and prop up the price. He manipulated the official exchange rate between paper and coin. He issued decrees. He begged. None of it worked. By the summer of 1720, the shares that had traded at 18,000 livres were worth 500, the original price. Every livre of wealth created during the mania had evaporated. The banknotes themselves, the very foundation of Law's system, were refused by shopkeepers. Bread sellers in Paris demanded coin. Riots erupted outside the bank. People were crushed to death in the crowds trying to convert paper into metal. On a single day in July, 16 people died in the stampede on the Rue Quincampoix. And John Law, the murderer, the gambler, the man who had been made Controller General of France, the most powerful financial official in the kingdom, fled Paris in disguise. Some accounts say he left in a servant's clothes. Others say he was smuggled out in a carriage belonging to a sympathetic duchess. What is certain is that he crossed into Belgium with almost nothing, perhaps a few hundred livres and a diamond ring. The man who had made France believe it was rich left France poorer than a common labourer. He spent his remaining years drifting again, as he had before the bubble. Venice, London briefly, Copenhagen. He gambled, but the old magic was gone. He wrote letters to the French court begging to return. They went unanswered. The man who had invented the Millionaire died in Venice in 1729, in a rented apartment, poor, ill, and largely forgotten. He was 58 years old. But here is what the financial histories rarely mention. Here is the entry the ledger tries to hide. Those 9,000 German settlers, the ones who survived, perhaps 2,000 of them, were never compensated, never apologized to, never acknowledged. They simply stayed. They had nowhere else to go. They drained the swamps. They planted rice and indigo. They built the communities along the German coast of Louisiana that exist to this day. The names are still there: Augsburg, Hoffen, Marienthal, fading on road signs in St. Charles Parish. They turned the lie into something real, but the cost of that transformation was paid in mass graves along the Mississippi, in children who never reached their first birthday, in women who boarded ships in Hamburg expecting paradise and found a floodplain of death. The paper that killed them is gone, burned or rotted or crumbled to nothing. But the principle behind that paper, the principle John Law proved beyond all doubt, survived. It survived because it was true. Money is belief. Every banknote in your wallet, every digit in your bank account, every figure on every stock exchange on earth operates on the same principle that John Law articulated in 1705. We simply got better at managing the belief. Central banks, reserve ratios, inflation targets, quantitative easing. These are the guardrails we built after Law showed us what happens without them. But the guardrails are not the road. The road is still the same road. Confidence in, value up. Confidence out, value gone. And every few decades, someone rediscovers what John Law discovered, that if you control the story, you control the money, and the cycle begins again. Think about it. In 2008, the world's largest financial institutions sold instruments backed by mortgages that would never be repaid and rated them AAA. The mortgages were the swamp, the ratings were the propaganda engravings, and the people who bought those instruments were the German settlers boarding ships for paradise. Different century, different continent, identical architecture. John Law was not a villain in the simple sense. He was what the Italian economist Carlo Cipolla would call a bandit, a man who profits at the direct expense of others. But he was also, in his own tragic way, a believer. He believed his system would work. He believed paper could save France. He believed that if you got the story right, the reality would follow. He was wrong, but he was wrong in a way that changed the world forever. The Mississippi bubble was not an aberration. It was the blueprint. And the next time you hold a banknote, any currency, any denomination, remember that you are holding a direct descendant of a theory written by a fugitive murderer in a rented room in Paris. A theory tested on the lives of 9,000 people who were told they were sailing to paradise. The theory worked, the paradise didn't. The ledger is long and the ruin is far from over. If you want to witness the next chapter of the collapse, sign your name below.